Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Falk, and I'm so glad you could join us today. The war in Ukraine is now at a critical stage, thanks to long-awaited arrival of U.S. munitions following approval by Congress of the $61 billion assistance package. Russia's recent advance towards Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, appears, at least for now, to have stalled. In another major development, which has the potential to change the landscape of the war, at the end of May, the Biden administration reversed an earlier prohibition. Ukraine is now permitted, with strict limitations, to use U.S.-provided weapons for defensive action inside Russia's borders. Despite these developments, most observers believe that neither Russia nor Ukraine really has a decisive advantage. There's rising concern that the U.S. might just be drifting towards another forever war. To bring insight and expertise to us, let me turn to our two experts. Bailey Hutchison served as U.S. Senator for Texas for 20 years and as U.S. Ambassador to NATO during the Trump administration from 2017 to 2021. Joining us also is David Kramer. He's the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute, and during his career at the Department of State, he held several key positions related to Russia and Ukraine. He's also the author of Back to Containment, Dealing with Putin's Regime. It's great to have you both here on the set. It's good to do that now as well.
Right.
So I'd like to start with you, Ambassador. Why should we care about this?
It is in the U.S. security interest that we help Ukraine, because having been at NATO and seen, talked to people who know how Putin moves, know what he says domestically, he wants to recreate the Mother Russia in the Soviet Union arena. And, of course, he started with Georgia, and he then did Crimea, and then, of course, that disastrous entry into Ukraine. And the view of everyone that I really know and trust, he wants to go on to the next and the next and the next. And if he's allowed to do Ukraine, then it will be a NATO country. There's no question in my mind. So how do we avoid that? We deter that action by helping Ukraine win and then become a part of NATO after we have some kind of a settlement that stops this Putin invasion.
I want to come back to Ukraine being a part of NATO, but David, how do you see this?
Well, I think the ambassador is right with everything she said. I would add that the full-scale invasion that we saw starting February 24th of 2022 represents the gravest security crisis on the European continent since the end of World War II. And let's remember, Europe was the source of 2 world wars in the last century. We're seeing massive war crimes, crimes against humanity, even possibly genocide committed by Russian forces against Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are the ones doing the fighting. They're not asking us to send our men and women to fight this fight for them. They do need our assistance. And it seems to me this is a tremendously important investment for the United States to make in the Ukrainian people on the front line of freedom to prevent the very scenario that Kay was talking about, which is Putin's continued move against other countries, including possibly NATO member states.
Should Ukraine be a member of NATO? And if so, when and how?
Yes, I think Ukraine should be a member of NATO. There are many of the states around Ukraine that are in NATO. There's no reason not to have Ukraine in NATO, as long as it's done after there is a settlement. You wouldn't take over the security relationship with a country that has Russian parts of the country already in place and saying that it's part of Russia, which it isn't. So I think that has to be settled. And then I think Ukraine certainly deserves a right to come into NATO, which they have asked for a long time. And it wasn't that they were refused, it is that they hadn't met the criteria for NATO when all of this happened.
And one of the criterion was corruption, and there were obviously
Yes.
other things. Are they making progress there?
Well, remember, Zelensky beat the incumbent president on the corruption issue, and there was progress being made that the corruption was being addressed, and it hadn't been finished, and Zelensky knew that, but he was trying to cobble together the legislation that was necessary to assure that there would be an anti-corruption rule of law that would be effective. And he was making progress. It's just that Russia came in really, now here's just my personal opinion, after Afghanistan and the disastrous leaving of Afghanistan, I think both Putin and President Xi of China said, if we're going to do what we have wanted to do, this is the time that America is weakest, and we are going to start making our moves, which then triggered first Putin, and then, of course, Xi is nibbling around the edges.
David, you've been involved in so many negotiations on tough conflicts. It strikes me that admission to NATO could be a really important bargaining chip to reach some type of settlement.
I would say, in adding to what Cade mentioned, NATO would be fortunate, lucky to have Ukraine as a member. There is no other country outside of NATO that has the experience fighting Russia as Ukraine has. There's no country inside NATO that has the experience of fighting Russia that Ukraine has. And Ukraine has performed heroically. It has shown it can contribute to NATO forces. Well before the full-scale invasion, NATO was benefiting from Ukrainian contributions to the efforts in Afghanistan,
yes,
to the efforts in Iraq. Ukraine is a contributor to European security. And on the issue of corruption, again, Kay is right on this. Zelensky was making some progress, not enough. Corruption has been a huge problem over the decades for Ukraine. But we have seen officials being fired. We have seen people brought up on charges. They are trying to do this in the middle of a full-scale invasion, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. Kay was also right. This was a promise back in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, where NATO issued a statement saying Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Didn't say how, didn't say when. It is now 2024, so 16 years later. When are Ukrainians really going to make that progress?
The scenario might have been very different if they had become a member of NATO.
I think that's true. And also remember, Ukrainians gave up nuclear weapons back in 1994 under an agreement signed by the United States, Russia, and the UK.
At our encouragement.
At our encouragement, relinquished its nuclear weapons.
Well, the last thing I want to do is channel Putin. But when he's sitting there in his office and he's looking at the map, does he not have any justification that as NATO becomes stronger, that he is more threatened?
None whatsoever. But remember the first invasion, Kay referred to this, in 2014. This happened after the Euromaidan revolution, where Ukraine had a pro-Russian president sitting in power. In 2013, Ukraine was about to sign agreements not with NATO, but with the European Union. Putin pressured President Yanukovych at that time not to sign those agreements. NATO was not being talked about. In fact, Ukraine passed legislation in 2010 saying it was no longer pursuing NATO membership. So that wasn't about NATO in 2014. It wasn't about NATO in 2022. Zelensky was trying to secure membership for Ukraine but after he was elected president, but wasn't making very much progress. This is because Putin doesn't view Ukraine as a separate independent state. He doesn't want Ukraine to succeed, to represent.
And he's been very vocal about that, and he's told our president.
He doesn't want Ukraine to be a possible alternative model to the authoritarian, rotten, corrupt system that he oversees in Russia.
Everything he is doing is for his purpose to create this diaspora of Soviet domination and
recreate the Warsaw Pact.
Yes, and for him to stand up and say, oh, well, you know, this is a provocation to have troops on our border. He knows we're a defensive alliance. He knows that we stick to our rules.
There's an old Soviet phrase going back to Stalin called getting dizzy with success. If Putin were to succeed in overrunning Ukraine and taking it over, his eyes will just get bigger. His appetite will grow with the eating. And he'll look at Moldova, which is also not a member of NATO. He'll take another look at Georgia, which is unfortunately Belarus, where he's already launched a de facto annexation because Lukashenko depends, the leader of Belarus, depends on Putin. So I think there's no question you don't defeat these bad guys by letting them have their way.
And to just add to that, we have evidence. And the evidence is they started with Georgia. That was fairly easy. We sort of lost attention. We protested and then went away. Europe did as well. And that caused Crimea. That success in Georgia, for everyone to sort of look the other way, then caused the much more bold Crimea invasion. And then he started putting the violation of the INF Treaty missiles right into Crimea and took complete control of it. That is the evidence of what David is saying, that success breeds more bold action. And that's why I think we have to be so careful to assure that we are helping Ukraine, because if he has that success, and there are these rollover countries like Moldova, like Belarus, that he could add and then say, you know, I'm the king of the world, and NATO is now focused on maybe other things, China, and this is my movement to do what he has told his own military he wants to do. He has said to his military, the worst thing that has happened in the history of Russia is Gorbachev, who was a traitor to Mother Russia, letting all of our satellite republics go. Yeah. And so that is his motivation, and that's why we in NATO are so strong to say, we've got to stop him now, and we can't lose focus, and we can't lose interest and start dribbling away.
So he was recently elected to another term. I don't know.
Elected in
right, exactly, in quotes.
Yeah.
But indeed, he's there for quite a lot more time. And the polls in Russia still show that he has support. But when we think about how the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, you know, it really was mothers who said, too many people have died. And yet, back at that time, there really was not the same strongman that you have with Putin. So will we see mothers demonstrating, and will it have any impact? And how many people, I've seen such different quotes, how many people do you think have died in Russia?
Well, the estimates so far, based on Western intelligence assessments, are over 500,000 Russians have been killed or wounded in this fighting in a period just over 2 years, way more than Soviet casualties from the invasion of Afghanistan. And we have seen some protests, but Putin has such tight control over Russian society these days, the slightest murmurs will trigger a response from the authorities. You will get arrested if you wear blue and yellow colors, because those are the colors of the Ukrainian flag. You will be arrested if your child said something in school that wasn't consistent with the Kremlin's narrative. And so it's pretty much a totalitarian state in Russia these days. Putin has very firm control. I wouldn't trust polls, though, in Russia these days. If I'm a stranger saying I'm conducting a poll in Russia... I don't trust
polls anywhere now.
Well, fair enough. But in Russia especially, somebody calls you up, you don't know them, and they say, what do you think about the job Putin's doing? You're either going to hang up or you're going to say 2 thumbs up. So polls these days I wouldn't trust. But there aren't major signs of opposition. The other thing, quickly, you mentioned the so-called election, Jim. Of course, the main opposition figure was killed in a Russian prison just a month before, Alexei Navalny. Nobody else was allowed to run who had a serious chance of winning. Putin has very tight control, unfortunately, inside Russia.
And just look at Navalny and what happens to a high-profile protester. Look at Prigozhin, for gosh sakes. I mean, he was telling the truth to power, and look what happened to him. I mean,
blown out of
it wasn't a window.
Plane
that,
was knocked down,
convenient.
sabotaged, whatever.
Yeah.
Right, the former head of the Wagner mercenary forces. I mean, and this is a consistent pattern that Kay is referring to, including a friend of mine, Boris Nemtsov, who was a Russian opposition figure, shot and killed yards from the Kremlin in 2015. Another friend of mine, Vladimir Karamurza, who's in a Russian prison today, poisoned twice, miraculously survived both times. This is what Putin does to people. And you don't have to be just within the borders of Russia.
No, we know
he goes
that.
after people
Right.
outside of Russia.
So,
Like
I could not
UK.
have,
Exactly.
we could not be more fortunate to have two more astute people on this issue. And, I'm holding here two articles which basically have the same title, Defining Success in Ukraine, How Does the War in Ukraine End? One written by Richard Haas, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and then Mick Mulvaney, who was former Chief of Staff. How do you all see this ending? Because Richard Haas is talking about a ceasefire, basically freezing the borders now. I don't think you'd agree with that.
I don't. No, I've disagreed with Richard on this issue for quite a while now. To me, success is possible for Ukraine if we provide the assistance they need. I would define success as being Ukraine successfully driving every Russian soldier off of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, holding Russia accountable for the war crimes, and then moving from freezing to seizing what are some $300 billion in Russian assets. The administration, I think, has been too slow in moving
Who
on
makes
this.
that decision?
It is a collective decision. Most of the money is in Europe. Most of the money is in Belgium and an organization called Euroclear. And so the U.S. is trying to pressure the Europeans to go along this. The Congress just passed legislation authorizing the administration to seize the money in the United States, but it's less than $10 billion. Most of the money is in Europe. We need to get the Europeans
Who's opposed to
support
it?
There were people opposed who worry about the precedent it would set. The Chinese will pull their money out of our country. Some are worried that they don't think it's the right principle to seize these funds. And so it's a complicated issue, but to me, it's also a pretty clear-cut issue. Russia should pay for the destruction and damage it has caused in Ukraine. It also alleviates the burden on us, the United States and Europe, if we make the Russians pay for the damage they've done.
But are you in favor of Ukraine taking back Crimea or going back to the, February 22 orders?
Well, first of all, if you start a peace negotiation, you have to start with the real boundaries of Ukraine. And you can start negotiating if Zelensky makes that decision and has the voice of the people. But you can't draw the lines at what Russia has already taken.
Right. You got to work. You got to negotiate.
And if you go to that point, I mean, I think there is a flexibility opportunity here to have some kind of a zone that is considered off limits for a negotiation to happen, but protecting the rights of the Ukrainians to their sovereign borders.
But Ambassador, has Zelensky not backed himself in a corner by saying so often we have to get all of our territory?
Well, I think he certainly has said that, and I think that is the right position for the president of a country to say. I think there has to be a look at the Donbass and what the real, again, Putin had a fake election in the Donbass and asked people to vote if they wanted to,
Right.
be under Russian control. And, of course, it was a 99% positive vote, which doesn't mean anything. I think you would have to set the boundaries or in some way make it clear that these are not Russian territories in order to start a negotiation. And then I think Zelensky has to make a decision based on probably what he knows and maybe we don't about where the Donbass situation is, and then Crimea, which is different from the taking of the Donbass. That one, that's a harder one, and I would see that having to be maybe an international zone that would have to be a negotiation in the beginning.
I just add to what Kay said, we have to remember Zelensky is a duly elected, democratically elected president of Ukraine. He won the election that Kay referred to in 2019 with 73% of the vote. The vast majority of Ukrainians are opposed to negotiations with Russia. The vast majority of Ukrainians believe they can achieve victory, and the vast majority of Ukrainians do not support territorial concessions to Ukraine. He has to pay attention to the sentiment of his population. He is in a tough spot, but he has said, as both of you have mentioned, he wants all of Ukrainian territory returned. Otherwise, you do run the risk of consigning millions of Ukrainians to living under Russia's repressive control, and no democratically elected leader would want that.
I mean, he was elected 5 years ago. There should have been an election this past May, but Ukraine is under martial law. So how long can we go, or Ukrainians go, because there now is more opposition being voiced without Zelensky standing for election?
Well, go ahead.
Oh, that has to be his decision. Yeah. And I just get very frustrated with people saying, well, we have to have an election now, in the middle of the man trying to marshal the forces and doing an incredible job of getting everything for his country that he could. Opposition forces, maybe some Russian implants, but don't. Well, you're up to your neck in alligators. Let's not talk about draining the swamp. I mean,
and here again, Ukraine is not a perfect, no country is, but a democracy. And most Ukrainians do not support holding elections right now based on surveys. Unlike in Russia, you can conduct surveys in Ukraine and trust the results. And the parliament also supports delaying the elections because, as you said, Jim, under Ukrainian law, if martial law is in existence, you cannot conduct elections. And why has this happened? Because Putin invaded the country. There's no one to blame for this situation other than Putin, who tried to spin this and say Zelensky is an illegitimate leader. Putin should look in the mirror if he wants to find an illegitimate leader.
This is such a critical year for NATO, celebrating its 75th anniversary. It's going to be a big event in Washington, D.C. in mid-July. What do you hope that comes out of that this year? Not just what happens in July, but...
It will be a reaffirmation of the importance of the alliance, of Europe and the U.S. and Canada together, also reaching out to Asia, which we haven't even covered, but really making significant partnerships with Asia countries, bringing their leaders into our summits. I think that unity message, I think we will get the appointment of the successor to Jens Stoltenberg for Secretary General. That has been kind of on hold and negotiated, but I think that will be done. And then I think just having the buildup, which is the real deterrence, which has been started really at the Madrid conference, the real interoperability, the hardening of our forces, all of that is being done at NATO for deterrence purposes. And then, of course, with Sweden and Finland, that is so much of a value added.
But on the sidelines at all these summit meetings, and I think you know what question I'm going to ask because it won't be the first time that you've heard this, we have an election coming up in the United States on November 5th. We have a president candidate who says, we don't really need to be a member of NATO. Is that just campaign rhetoric, or what do you expect if former President Trump, is reelected?
I expect no difference. I expect that he will continue to use his tactics to bring Europe more up to speed. But now we have a law in place that a president cannot withdraw from NATO. It takes an act of Congress
to that a new law?
Ratify. It was signed into law last December. So it takes congressional approval now to withdraw from NATO. And if you took a vote in Congress, you would not have anywhere close to a majority to withdraw from NATO, because the value of NATO is a value to the United States. And so that is not in peril at this election.
One other point just on that, President Trump made a huge issue about other countries' defense spending. And from
this burden sharing.
Burden sharing. And we have seen more and more countries meet or approach the 2% threshold, which is 2% of GDP spent on defense. So he gets credit for that. The current administration, even previous administrations, have been pushing the Europeans to take more ownership of security in Europe. And as long as that happens, I hope that NATO will remain a sacrosanct alliance.
I'll just add one more thing, and it is so important to see who President Trump, if that is what happens November 5th, is who he puts in Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and I think that is going to be crucial. I know when I was at NATO and there was a lot of turmoil with President Trump making statements, and I never had a Secretary of State or Defense that wasn't with me 100%, that we understood the importance of NATO to the American people.
A lot's going to depend on what happens in the Senate, who has control there.
Correct.
So one thing that I've been watching and wondering about is Ukraine had its big counteroffensive a year ago, was not effective, and now they're saying there won't be one in 2024. There won't be a counteroffensive probably until 2025. We have just a few, another 30 seconds or so, but how do you see that? Why is it taking so long?
Well, I'm in favor of not telegraphing when a counteroffensive would be launched.
That's good advice, probably.
By surprise, let the Russians know when they're being hit with a counteroffensive. The Ukrainians had a gap when U.S. assistance was being provided until Congress voted to approve it. They actually have done remarkably well, all things considered, and the Russians didn't take advantage of that interim period in trying to capitalize. So I still remain optimistic about Ukraine and its prospects. The counteroffensive will come when the Russians feel it.
And you and I were talking in the green room before the show that Ukraine's taking the war wherever, and even may have special forces in Africa.
They are not hesitating to go after Russians wherever they might be. Russian forces, to be clear, not
Right.
Russian civilians, unlike the Russian forces who go after Ukrainian civilians deliberately.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. This is an important topic that sadly will be with us for certainly the foreseeable future. With the U.S. involved in 2 wars and other global uncertainties, 2024 just might be different. We're so grateful to Ambassador Hutchison and David Kramer for their service to our country and for joining our discussion where we talk about things that matter with people who care.